David here with Figboot on Pens, back again with another ink review. Today I have for you not one, but two limited edition inks from Papier Plume. The Chicago Pen Show is coming up this weekend. Each year, for quite a few years, Papier Plume has released either one or two limited edition inks during the show. These are inks that are available for attendees of the Chicago show, and after the show is over, if there are any left, sometimes there is and sometimes there isn't, they will be made available on the Papier Plume website. One of the inks is called Lake Michigan Winter, and the other, Bad Bad Leroy Brown. Thanks go out to Patrick from Papier Plume for providing these inks for review. Papier Plume has an online presence, but also has a brick and mortar location in New Orleans. If you are ever in the area, I highly recommend a visit. There aren't a lot of physical pen stores around, so visiting a cool one like Papier Plume is definitely worth the effort. Okay, in order to take a closer look at these two new inks, please join me over here at camera 2. So here are the inks. First we have Lake Michigan Winter, and then we have Bad Bad Leroy Brown. These are 30 milliliter bottles, and so it's a nice amount of ink. And these typically sell for about $10. I just love these wax seals that they put on the top of most of their ink bottles. I think it's a really nice touch. I think it makes the bottles unique. The wax is different on every one, which is kind of cool. Papier Plume has previously come out with a Lake Michigan Summer ink, which kind of was a similar color to this winter, but slightly darker. This is what the Lake Michigan Winter looks like. It's kind of a nice seafoam green. In regard to some other seafoam greens, which I don't have a lot, here is Diamine's Eau de Nil. And then here it is with Noodler's Brown Nose Bear. And then here it is with something a little bit darker, which was actually the last ink I reviewed, which was Three Oysters Marine Green. And then we have Bad Bad Leroy Brown. This is what the color looks like. Here it is with some Pilot Orochizuku. And then we have the Seitz Kreuzschnack Chestnut Brown. Something like the Krone Tutankhamen is a little bit, I'd say a little bit redder. The Pelikan Edelstein Smoky Quartz is a very close match. The Conway Stewart King Sand, again, is a little bit more red. And then here it is with a Three Oysters Gogung. Gogung? I'm not too up on my Korean, but I believe that's how it's pronounced, or something very similar to that. In regard to Bad Bad Leroy Brown, if you're not familiar, this was the name of a song released back in 1973 by a singer by the name of Jim Croce, who was a very popular singer-songwriter in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Leroy Brown was his most popular song. It reached #1 on the American charts. And at the bottom here, it's hard to see, but it says a badass fountain pen ink. And then it's actually kind of neat because in the background, it has the lyrics to the song, which are about a man from the south side of Chicago who was big and tough and threw his weight around until he made a pass at a married woman. He gets in a fight with her jealous husband, and Leroy proceeds to lose the fight very badly. Okay, this is what some smears and swab of the ink look like. You know, I laid it on pretty heavy, and you can see that there is a bit of shading on here, and it seems like the color has a tendency to pool a little bit when I'm just putting a large amount on there. When I'm using a Q-tip to swab, it seems a little bit more consistent, but it's kind of a dusty brown. And that then this is what the Lake Michigan Winter looks like. Again, when you lay it on really thick, there is a bit of shading, and when you use the Q-tip, then there is not quite as much. In regard to this thinner paper, this is some 52-gram Tomoe River paper. That in regard to the Lake Michigan winter, there's virtually no bleed through or ghosting, but on the Bad Leroy Brown, there is a bit. Now, I laid on a bunch of ink here, but I do think that this was kind of interesting because only the yellow element of the ink bled through, not any of the purple element of the ink. And, you know, while this seafoam green of Lake Michigan winter is nice, it's a bit light for my tastes, but I do know a lot of folks out there like the lighter inks. So for this writing sample, I kind of wanted to focus on the Bad Leroy Brown. So here we go. This is the Papier Plume Bad Leroy Brown. For this header as well as for the passes, I use this 2.4 millimeter Pilot Parallel, which is a nice pen to use for things like that. This is Rhodia 80-gram paper. And I do find on this paper that the bleed and the ghosting is rather low, that I don't find that it has much on here at all. On the thinner paper, there was a bit more. I'd say the shade is on the medium side. It only really comes out when you apply a lot of ink. And I'd say the sheen is rather low. It's kind of a dusty brown. In regard to some pens, what I'm going to use today is, first of all, this Lamy All-Star. And this is the very first pen I ever purchased. And it is a fine nib. So for fine, we have a Lamy All-Star. And that is fine. Then for a medium pen, I have a pen that I'm going to be reviewing here in the very near future and actually giving away, which is a Conklin Mark Twain Crescent Filler. So we have a Conklin Mark Twain. And this is a medium nib. And I have noticed that there isn't a ton of difference between the Lamy fine nib and this Conklin medium nib. And then finally, another pen that I will be reviewing and giving away here in the near future, which is this Retro 51 P51 Mustang. And so we have here the Retro 51 P51 Mustang Tornado. And this is actually a 1.1 stub. Now, if you've seen any of my previous ink reviews, you know that I like to tie in a discussion about a film that loosely relates to the ink. Since these inks are debuting at the Chicago Pen Show, I wanted to talk about one of my favorite Chicago-based movies. If I hadn't already discussed Blues Brothers, I would have here, but I did that in my last ink review. So another Chicago film I love is Ferris Bueller's Day Off. So here we have a few quotes from the film. So first of all, with the Lamy All-Star, the question isn't what we are going to do. The question is, what aren't we going to do? The story of the film revolves around the main character, Ferris Bueller, and his adventures with his friends when they decide to skip school and run around Chicago in a vintage 1961 Ferrari. It's funny because in the film, Ferris, while he's breaking a lot of rules, is very likable. I do like to read a lot of film scripts, and in the original script for this film, Ferris was not very likable. Like there was a scene in the script where he stole some bonds from his parents and cashed them at the bank in order to finance his adventures for the day. There were other differences between the original script and the film that actually ended up on the screen that actually painted him in a slightly different light. The next quote from the film is one from Ferris, again, and it says, "Life moves pretty fast. If you don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it." And like I said before, the fine Lamy and the medium Conklin, there's not a big difference between the two of those. Ferris Bueller's Day Off was released in 1986 and was written and directed by John Hughes. John Hughes really owned the 1980s. He did an excellent job of immortalizing adolescence on the screen throughout the decade with such films as 16 Candles, The Breakfast Club, Home Alone, and of course, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Hughes wasn't just a teen movie director, he really wrote about teens as if they were adults. He treated their own problems and angst with seriousness, and he didn't write down to them. He really wrote at their level. He made films that people could really associate with and have really stood the test of time. And then the final quote is one from his friend Cameron, which says, "My father spent 3 years restoring this car. It is his love. It is his passion." During one of my favorite scenes in the film, they visit the Art Institute of Chicago, which is one of my favorite museums. And while there, Cameron stares at the most famous work of Georges Seurat, called Sunday Afternoon on the Island of Grand Shahad. Among other things, the painting shows the tenderness of a mother and child, something that was really lacking in Cameron's own life. With this style of painting called pointillism, the closer you look at something, the less you see. And Cameron is afraid that the more you look at him, the less you'll see. And he really lives under the dominance of his materialistic father and emotionally absent mother. When I first saw this film as a teenager, it was my first exposure to the works of Seurat, and it's really turned into one of my favorite paintings. Whenever I visit Chicago, like I actually will be later this summer, I make it a point to visit the Art Institute and stand in front of this painting and stare at the little girl, just like Cameron. The last time I was there, I actually took a picture of her, and it is actually what I have set on the wallpaper of my phone. I do find this ink to be very wet. You can see here in the drying time, it did take a good 30 seconds to dry, or actually at 30 seconds it wasn't dry for both the fine and the medium, but it was dry by 60 seconds. I do find the Bad Bad Leroy Brown to be a bit undersaturated, creating kind of a warm, dusty brown. I feel that the ink is very wet in a variety of nibs and has a rather long drying time, as evident by this drying time sample there. And then finally, Papier Plume continues to create unique and creative inks, which are fantastic. And I always like to see what they come out with. So let's take a look at this water test. Put a little water on here and let this sit here just for a second. And while the water sets, let's take a look at the chromatography. First up, this is the Lake Michigan Winter. You can see here that this is comprised mostly of blue with some elements of gray and green. And then here's the Bad Bad Leroy Brown. There are several different color combinations that can make up a brown. You can tell here with this particular one that it's mainly comprised of purple with a bit of yellowish gold. And then here are what the strips look like after they dried. Again, you can see here that there's a little bit of gray, a lot of purple, and then kind of a yellowish gold right there. And I just think it's kind of cool to see how this color breakdown and that it's totally different than the ink that's actually on the page. And then here is the winter, or the Lake Michigan Winter, and you can say there's a little bit of gray and blue, and then there's some green, and then a little bit more of a vibrant blue. Let's go ahead and take this off. I will say that the purple, you know, they don't market this as being waterproof, but the purple held up really pretty well. You know, I wouldn't necessarily call it waterproof, but it's not too bad. If you would care to pick up either of these two inks, they are available, like I mentioned, in limited quantities at the Chicago Pen Show. And if there are any left after the show, then they'll be available on the Papier Plume website. I'll put a link to their site in the notes below. Thanks go out to Papier Plume for providing these inks for review and for me to share with you. Until next time, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you later.